All right, today's guest speaker is Dr. Scott Austin. Scott is a Michigan native. He completed a BS in physics at Michigan State University in 1987. He moved to Tempe, Arizona to pursue a graduate degree at Arizona State University, where he earned a PhD in physics in 1995. Scott taught at Grays Harbor College in Aberdeen, Washington, Penn State Erie, and at Washington State University. He took his current position at the University of Central Arkansas up in Conway in the Department of Physics and Astronomy in the fall of 2000, and he was granted tenure in the spring of 2006. At UCA, Scott teaches lower division astronomy and upper division physics courses. Scott is also director of astronomical facilities and has renovated the UCA observatory so that a variety of research projects are being done with the new 0.35 meter telescope. Scott also does public outreach with the observatory and the 60-seat planetarium by opening each facility to the public once a month. And we have those posted on our meetup site, and you're all welcome to attend. And those are all free. Scott's been a member of ASF since last summer. Gave a very interesting talk on the variable stars, I believe it was last July. And he's back here tonight for an encore performance, today that is. Today's talk is Astronomical Pseudoscience, some of the weird questions I'm sometimes asked. So please welcome Dr. Scott Austin.
Thanks for the introduction. So last time, as Dave said, the last time I talked, I gave more of a scientific talk over the general area of research that I do in variable star research. But being an astronomer, I field questions from time to time from general public and students and so forth. And sometimes those questions are related to science and things that people are reading in the news and so forth about science and astronomical discoveries and the like. But some fraction of the questions I get deal with weird things, things that don't fall under the category of science and fall more under what we would call pseudoscience. And probably a lot of you are familiar with pseudoscience versus science, but to ground ourselves a little bit here, let's compare and contrast science versus pseudoscience. This is a quote from, or a paraphrase from Neil deGrasse Tyson, which I like. It's a good summary of basically the scientific method and the point of the scientific method. Neil says, science is basically doing whatever is necessary so that you don't fool yourself when you're trying to figure out how the universe works, for example. So when you're addressing some sort of question using the scientific method, you're going to do a lot of testing. If you've got some idea, some sort of theory about how something works, you better be able to test it. That theory better have predictions that you can test, and so forth. So that's the essence of doing science. Now, pseudoscience are basically things that don't hold up to those tests and those predictions that people try to pass off as being science and pass off as if they've passed the rigorous test of science. Basically claims, beliefs, anything people are trying to pass off as having some sort of scientific legitimacy, but upon actual scientific research don't hold up to a real scientific rigorous testing. So what I'm going to touch on today are things that I've specifically been asked about that fall under this sort of pseudoscience category. There are other things, other astronomical pseudoscience topics that I'll mention at the end that I haven't specifically been asked about, but we can talk about them as well if you would like. One thing to keep in mind about pseudoscientific claims, people making pseudoscientific claims are probably either fooling themselves and or trying to fool others, and sometimes they're trying to fool others for profit. So you have to keep that in mind as well. Now, scientists aren't immune to getting fooled. And in fact, some of you have probably been reading some of the news headlines about this whole thing about neutrinos going faster than the speed of light. That's an example where some scientists have basically, for a while, fooled themselves, but it's also a good example of how science works. Science says, okay, you better prove this, and you better prove it rigorously, and they weren't able to. And so the latest research on that is neutrinos don't go faster than the speed of light. There was a problem with their equipment. So again, scientists aren't immune, but scientists really have to come up with the goods, the proof of what they're claiming. Now, I'd also claim that pseudoscientific beliefs are kind of both a symptom and a contributor to scientific illiteracy in terms of the general public. They stem from it and contribute to it. So let me show you some examples, do a little bit of story time here in terms of some of the things I've been asked. I got a phone call a few years ago from a school principal, and he had this request for me. And in fact, the story was the school spent a lot of time doing a fundraiser to raise money so that they could buy each kid in the 4th grade a star. Okay? Now you're probably looking at maybe a couple of 4th grade classes. You might be looking at maybe upwards of 60 kids. Okay? So they had already done this by the time he called me, unfortunately. His request was, could I bring some telescopes to the school some night so that they could see these stars? Okay. Some of you may be familiar with this, where they're, quote, buying stars. I've also had students and general public who have shown up at observatory nights talk about this same sort of thing, where they've bought their significant other for a birthday present or something. They bought that person a star, and they want to know if we can point the telescope and look at the star. Now, this sounds harmless, but it's not as harmless as you may think. And the reason I consider this falling under pseudoscience is the person that's quote selling these stars is kind of passing himself off as some sort of official scientific entity. Okay. Now, like I said, some of you may be familiar with this. If you're not, don't buy anything from this guy. Okay. There's something called the International Star Registry. This has been around for a long time. He's been doing this for several years. This is even before the web and everything like that. He's been doing this. You can go on the web, and this is a snapshot from his website. And for a fee between $50 and $500, depending on how much you want to give him and what sort of package you want to get, he'll name a star for you and print out certificates and this, that, and the other thing and put it in an envelope and give it to you. He's not affiliated with anything official. Okay? This is the same as any one of you starting a website selling property on the moon or selling a galaxy, or, you know, if you've got a computer and a nice printer and you can print out nice looking certificates, you can go into this business. Okay? Now, where this sounds harmless and isn't is this first example phone call. Do the math. You're talking at least $50 a kid and upwards of maybe 50 or 60 kids. Okay? He wanted me to bring a telescope. Do the math. They could have bought a telescope for the school. Okay? So they wasted a lot of money on something that they thought was something to do with science and basically wasted a lot of money. Things didn't work out in terms of the weather and things, so I never did get out there to do a star night with them, but I kind of diplomatically as I could kind of indicated that probably wasn't the best thing to do, and that probably he needed to call me before this project started. But so again, this International Star Registry is basically a scam. You know, it may sound fun and harmless, but as you can see, it can cost some people some real money. So my suggestion is use your money to buy your significant other a real present, or just print out a certificate yourself and save yourself a lot of money. The thing about stars, any sort of star that you're going to be able to see with your eyes or the pair of binoculars or a small telescope, that star will have some sort of name and or catalog designation And chances are it shows up in several different catalogs. There are databases that you can go online and you can put in the coordinates for a star and it will pull up and it will tell you if it has a proper name and all the different catalog names it has and so forth and other information about it. So any of these people who are buying a star, there's not going to be an astronomer in the whole world who are ever going to refer to that star as Mary's star or Joe's star or whatever.
Has anybody tried to prosecute this or other companies like it? Because it's a clear case of fraud. They're obtaining money and without under false.
I don't know if they can get this guy on fraud, because he would probably claim in court that he's not really claiming to be anything. Would be my guess. We'll ask the lawyer, but that would be my guess in terms of that. I don't know if anybody has. I don't know the answer to that. But yeah, I would be happy to see this guy taken down. But now there is an official place that names stars. The official body for this is something called the International Astronomical Union. It's basically a congress of astronomers from around the world that get together periodically and settle on names for things like stars, asteroids, comets, anything astronomical. They'll settle on names. You probably more recently heard about them in the news because they're also the body that recataloged Pluto as a dwarf planet. Okay, so they're involved in that sort of thing. So, of course, they don't sell naming rights to objects. And when it comes to stars in particular, if I discover a new star, I don't get to name it after myself. I don't get to name it after anybody. Okay? The only objects that you can really name after people that the International Astronomical Union will let you name after people are like comets and asteroids. And that's one of the reasons certain amateur astronomers like to go out and try to find comets and asteroids, and they can name them after themselves. Variable stars, you're not that lucky. You don't get to name them after yourself. But so that's one example of what I would call pseudoscience. This guy's putting himself up there as a scientific entity, which he really isn't. This is probably more of a classic pseudoscience sort of example that I've gotten a phone call on. Probably almost 10 years ago I got this phone call. This is kind of a paraphrase of what he was asking. But I got this phone call, and he's wanting to come to the planetarium because he wanted to verify something in a book that he read. He wasn't real forthcoming about the book that he was reading, but I finally got it out of him. I'd never heard of this up to this point. These things take me off guard at times. But the author of the book that this guy was reading, and maybe anybody familiar with Stitchin's books? Okay, one person. It's in the sort of von Daniken, Ancient Astronauts, and some of these others. It's similar to that, where he's supposedly translated some ancient texts that talk about some planet. Sometimes you may hear this called Planet X. Sometimes you may hear this called Nibiru, Planet 10. This has various names. And this is a diagram from his book showing this object Nibiru making this long elliptical orbit, and that it comes into the solar system. And the claim is that sometime in a distant past, this planet came through, and maybe you know more about this than I do, or there were probably aliens on it and the whole 9 yards, interacting with humans on the Earth, the usual story, I'm guessing, right? And so he wanted to come to the planetarium. He's got kind of the right idea in terms of wanting to check things out. In principle, we can set the planetarium for any date in the future or the past. His kind of idea was, could we wind it back to the date that this guy's referring to, and would we be able to see what this guy's claiming? Well, the short answer would be no, because that's not part of the planetarium projectors. Planet Nibiru isn't one of the things that's designed to project. But this guy is no longer with us, which may be a good thing. But this is an example of a guy who's not an expert in the area doing something. And what he's not really an expert is translating Sumerian text. And this is the only guy in the world who has translated and interpreted these Sumerian texts to tell that story. You know, the people who actually do this for a living don't get anything remotely what this guy is translating. So either this guy was really, really fooling himself or was making stuff up. You know, I don't know. You choose. The fact that he sold lots of books I would kind of come down on. He probably knows that he was fooling everybody and was making stuff up. But in fact, this has come up more recently as well. Talk about evolution. Evolution happens in pseudoscience. Some of this stuff gets mashed together with other things, other pseudoscientific things. This question I was asked last year in 2010. We've got a convergence here of some pseudoscientific concepts, and if you're familiar with some of the 2012 doomsday things, some of this is being mashed together with Stitchin's ideas. And so these people are looking for anything that's coming into the solar system that might cause doomsday here on the Earth. And there was a bit of a buzz in 2010 when a newly discovered comet called Comet Ellen, named after, this is an example where you could name something after yourself, was discovered. And so this apparently was going around the internet that maybe this is the planet X, maybe this is Nibiru, and so forth. And so it's interesting how some of this gets mashed up together and takes on a new life of its own. There was also some claims at the time that NASA was doing a cover-up on this. I had a student ask me about that as well. I'll touch on that a bit later as well. So there's a lot of this 2012 doomsday business. There's not a consistent scenario for this if you look into it. There's people claiming all different sorts of things. Some of you probably heard about the Mayan calendar being part in the mix here. One of the things that's also in the mix, and I've been asked about this as well, one of the things that might cause doomsday, according to some of these people, is an alignment, an astronomical alignment of the sun with the center of our galaxy. And this is another one where I'm, again, paraphrasing here a bit, where people wanted to come in and see if we could set the planetarium to December 2012 to see this alignment. This we can actually do in the planetarium. We can set it to December 2012. The sun is a real object, unlike Nibiru, so we can actually do this. The galactic center is something real. So we can, in principle, set the planetarium projector up on December 2012 and see what we get. The short answer is we get what you'll get every year that you've been alive and into the future. This happens every year. In December, the sun is approximately in the same part of the sky relative to the Earth and the galactic center. Okay? So you get this approximate alignment every year. So here we are, 2012. This is a snapshot from a planetarium program that I have. The galactic center, this is the constellation of Sagittarius. The galactic center is right there in that image. This dotted line here is the plane of our galaxy, the Milky Way, and then the line cutting across that way, that's the plane of our solar system. So as we go around the sun, the sun's going to trace out that horizontal line. Well, technically, even on December 2012, they're not directly aligned even then. Okay, so you know, notice this is as close as they're going to get on the sky. And that's about as close as it gets anywhere in December 2012. So, and even if it did perfectly align, there's a so what there too. You know, you write down Newton's law of gravity and you do the calculation, the extra gravitational pull is minute at best. So what's the physical basis for anything bad happening, even if that does happen? Some of you may have remembered some scenarios like this for planetary alignments, for example, back in the 70s, where people were doing some doomsday tidal things as well at that time. So some of this 2012 madness is trying to tap into that sort of idea as well. So it's kind of incoherent in terms of what's going to cause the doomsday in 2012. How many have gotten the Mars email? Okay. How many times have you gotten it? What month do you get it? August. Okay. This is interesting from several perspectives. It's somewhat pseudoscientific. It's also an example of a garbled chain letter. And I've gotten asked by several people about this, and even my mother has forwarded this message to me. If you haven't gotten the Mars email before, this is kind of what it looks like and what it's claiming. It's claiming that you're going to be able to go outside at night, look up at the sky, and Mars is going to appear to be as big as the moon on the sky. Okay? Which is not going to happen. We never get that close to Mars. Okay? If that were to happen, something drastically has gone wrong. The origins of this, as best I can guess, is someone read a detailed explanation of what was going to happen in August of that year, didn't understand some of the things that they were talking about up to a certain point, and then read, it's going to look as big as the moon. And that's the thing that they kind of zoomed in on. What the original description was talking about was, if you looked at Mars through a telescope at a particular magnification, Mars would look as big as the moon without magnification. Okay? And so this got garbled. Okay? Now this started in August or in 2003. You may remember back in 2003 a lot of talk about being as close to Mars as we've been in thousands of years. Okay? That was correct. And Mars looked in August of that year as bright and as big as it can get, basically, given the shapes of our orbits. And I'll show you that here in a minute. The weird thing is this thing resurrects itself every August and goes out on the internet again. I don't know why. I don't know why this resurrects itself and people pass it around again and again. So every year since, including last year, 2011, in August, this has gone around. Has anybody gotten a Mars email this month? Okay. Well, we're at opposition this month of this year. Back on March 3rd, we were at closest approach. We weren't as close as we were back in 2003, but you didn't get an email about it. Okay. These closest approaches don't always happen in August. Okay. So let me show you a picture of what we're talking about. If you plot in an exaggerated way the orbits of the Earth and Mars, our orbit is pretty close to being circular. Mars's orbit is more elliptical. The other thing is we orbit the sun faster than Mars. Okay? So we catch up to and we pass Mars roughly every 2.5 years. Okay? And so this table here showing you when these closest approaches occur are what we call oppositions. In other words, Mars is going to be opposite on the sky to the sun. Okay? And so in 2003, given the shape of Mars's orbit, we caught it when Mars was as close as it gets to the sun, and so that's why we were as close as what we get to it. If you went out and looked at it this year, 2012, it wouldn't look quite as bright or quite as big, but almost. There's not a huge difference here. But again, this doesn't happen every year, and it doesn't happen every August. So 2005, 7, 10, 12, and so on in the future, and there's not another August on any of those. Okay? So it'll be interesting to see if that male comes around again August of this year. So it's interesting. Someone should do a psychological study or sociological study in terms of what's happening there. Probably similar to the psychology of other chain letters that you may have gotten before. Time to time, I get questions concerning things like calendars, timekeeping, that sort of thing. And these are some examples of some of that. One popular thing that I've been asked a few times is, one of the stories in the Bible is something about God making the sun stand still. And so, obviously, there's a missing day, right? And then there are other calendar-related things in terms of, why can't we exactly know when Jesus was born and things of that nature. It kind of highlights some people's misconceptions about timekeeping, those sorts of things. The universe doesn't have a universal calendar. There's not some counter somewhere in the universe ticking off the days. Okay? Basically, we do that, right? So we mark off the days. And over time, we've come up with different calendar systems because we base our timekeeping on things like the rotation of the Earth, the orbit of the moon, the time it takes the Earth to go around the sun, things like that. And they're not all even multiples of each other. And so there's all that to try to mesh together, and that's the reason for things like leap days and leap seconds, and to get all of that evened out so that you have the first day of spring actually happen astronomically where it should be, and things like that. So again, some of this highlights some of the misunderstandings in terms of that, in terms of timekeeping, how we determine ages of things, things like that. So it's pretty obvious some people have this idea that time is how many times the Earth goes around. It's somehow time in the rotation of the Earth is causing time to go, right? So if the Earth didn't rotate, time would stop. That's the sort of idea that some people have. Yes, we use the rotation of the Earth to mark off time, but that if you stop the Earth's rotation, that wouldn't stop time. Okay, and so finding a missing day is just nonsensical. And how many people have heard of this one before? Have you? This next one probably really doesn't quite fall in the pseudoscience category, but I thought I would put this in here. From time to time, I'll have a student or a general public come, and they'll have a piece of rock or slag or something that some family member claimed they saw fall from the sky, and they want to know if it's a meteorite or not. Most of the time, they're not meteorites; they're meteor wrongs. They're just earth rocks or slag or something like that. There are ways that these can be tested. One of my colleagues at UCA has the available equipment to do some simple tests to be able to tell whether it's an asteroid or just a rock, or a meteorite or just a rock. The Arizona State University Center for Meteorite Studies used to let the general public send little samples in, and they would test it and send you a report. And in fact, I've done that before. I don't think they do so anymore for the general public. At least they don't do it without charging now. Okay? They used to do this basically free of charge. If you'd send them a little sample of it, they would send you a report back. One interesting case of this is when I was teaching in Pennsylvania. Some people had, it was a real interesting rock. The thing was huge, and they literally bought it at a garage sale because the people were claiming that someone saw it fall as a meteorite. And on first inspection, you couldn't rule it out. The thing was magnetic. You could stick pieces of metal to it. That's one possibility. And so they let us chip off a piece of it and send it in, and it didn't pass the additional test for being a meteorite. But it was probably some sort of rock that was moved from further north down during one of the ice ages. The glaciers probably brought that down from the Canadian Shield, probably down to Pennsylvania. Earlier, that I'd get back to this. A lot of questions, some of the questions that I get start with NASA says, and then whatever they've read. And sometimes this is also used as justification for conspiracies. You know, some people have the misconception that all space research gets done by this government agency. Okay, sounds very Big Brother, right? Especially in astronomy, if you look at where astronomers work, they work at places like I work. Okay, most of us don't work explicitly for NASA. Some do. Some astronomers do. Some astronomers do get grants from NASA from time to time, although the bulk of the federal money for doing astronomy doesn't come from NASA. It comes from the National Science Foundation. So when people come to me claiming that there's some NASA conspiracy about some sort of astronomical topic, I kind of scratch my head, how can that be? There's the bulk of astronomers around the world don't work for NASA. How can NASA control what I or anybody else do? And if the object is bright enough, there's nothing stopping anybody with an 8 or 10-inch telescope from going out and looking. So,
Is there much private money going into astronomical research?
Not a whole lot that I'm aware of, no. So it's, if you look at the budget pie for astronomical research, probably the bulk of it comes from National Science Foundation, and then probably the next largest pie may be from NASA, and then if there's private money, it's a small little slice of the pie. So I don't see how NASA can control us knowing about Nibiru, if it actually exists or anything like that. So, but again, that gets used for conspiracy theories, that NASA's covering up that comet. Well, if you got a big enough telescope, you can go out and see it yourself. You know, nobody's stopping it. So those are kind of examples of some of the things I've been asked explicitly. Fortunately, the current secretary I've got in the physics department office is pretty good about screening calls. So I actually haven't gotten too many crackpot calls in a while, which is fine with me. But some other things that you may have heard about, things that I haven't necessarily been asked. This is a list from a website mainly aimed at us astronomers so that we can talk about some of these things that are rolling around out there. Astrology, I think there's some good news on that front. I've never really been asked anything explicitly about astrology. Okay, I don't think astrology is much in the popular culture as it was in the 60s and the 70s. So I think the good news there is people generally, I don't think, have an idea what astrology even is. Because the problem I have with the astrology right now is people misusing the word. I think people are to the point where they don't really know what astrology is. They think it has something to do with science and astronomy. And so they'll ask me if I teach astrology classes and things of that nature. Which kind of leads me to believe that they don't know astrology is about horoscopes and those sorts of things. So that's the good news. The bad news is, unfortunately, that looks like it ought to be a science, right? Unfortunately, that word got co-opted a long time ago. So you can kind of forgive them a little bit for thinking maybe that's what another name for astronomy, but it isn't. Haven't really had anybody ask me about UFOs and aliens or crop circles. I don't know if anybody knows about the Face on Mars issue. The Dogoon tribe in Sirius B, I think that's another in the vein of Nibiru-like story. The Worlds in Collision thing, that was, what, 60s and 70s, that was going around, popular, as was the ancient astronauts and so forth. It sounds like some of these pseudoscience cable channels run some stuff like that anymore, so that's bad news on that front. Yeah.
History Channel.
So, which, again, those channels are representing themselves as being legitimate in terms of the information that they're giving. So that's unfortunate that they have been doing that. But so I'll stop there. I'll take questions if you want to ask questions or comments or.
Anyone have a question?
Or anybody hear weird things that I haven't heard of?
More a comment than a question. NASA did just recently make an announcement putting down the Mayan calendar nonsense, saying that this is no different than rolling over from December 31st to January 1st in our calendar.
Yeah, the broader point that I find interesting, and some people debate this in terms of should NASA actively address some of these issues or not, because it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you really want to educate the public, okay? But on the other hand, you bring up those issues, even bringing it up somehow gives it legitimacy. And the fact that NASA is doing it, like I said, if people are coming at it already that NASA is this government agency that controls space science, NASA saying something isn't true isn't going to faze some people. So people have debated that. Should NASA be doing that sort of public outreach to even bring up these issues? Another example in that same vein is number 10 there. They have a big struggle with that. That's a pride issue. We sent people to the moon, and you got people out there thinking we didn't. And it's, again, a catch-22 that if they bring that issue up, again, the nefarious agency, conspiracy theories. So, I don't know. What do you do? it's.
Well, I've had half a dozen times over the years people with saying that the Apollo program was a hoax.
Did you go Buzz Aldrin on them?
And dealt with them individually. They had literature proving, that this picture couldn't possibly have been taken on the moon.
Yeah, and so that's another prime example of pseudoscience stuff. I didn't talk about it because I had never been really asked much about that, but yeah, where they'll have very scientific sounding ideas. And if you remember a few years ago, Fox did a whole special on it, and they'll list these very scientific sounding reasons why all the pictures are a hoax and all of that, but.
And on the other one, Velikovsky there, the guy who hired me for my first professional job in the aerospace industry was a brilliant mathematician, a guidance and controls engineer who had invented a lot of the basic stuff in the field. He was also a true believer in Velikovsky, which was the first person I'd ever run across who was that combination of very good in one technical field and at the same time a complete loony.
So that's interesting just from a neuroscience standpoint of to be creative, it's nice to be able to think out of the box, but you don't want to think too far out of the box that your brain falls out of your skull. You know, it's that fine line between the two.
Just kind of tagging along to the end of that question with the Great Moon Hoax, what level of, I imagine to get a telescope to look at the moon to actually try and find that manually, you wouldn't need a magnification that great, would you?
Oh, you mean to see the landers and stuff on the moon? Yeah. You can't. The angular size of something at that distance, you're not going to be able to see directly with a telescope, even the largest telescopes, or even something like the Hubble Space Telescope. NASA has sent some space probes to the moon that have orbited the moon, and you can go online and you can see the orbital view of the landing sites where you can barely see the landers, you can see where they walked around and drove the rovers around. Unfortunately, if you're into conspiracies, you're going to say, well,
it's not going to satisfy you.
And they photoshopped all that. So
exactly.
What do you do?
Yeah, I was looking at that the other day. That's why I brought it up.
Yeah. But yeah, if you work out what sort of angular resolution you need to be able to resolve something of that size at that distance, even the largest telescopes you can. You know, the craters that you're seeing on the moon, they're a small telescope. You're looking at things that are hundreds of miles across. Yeah.
I was just wondering, you sort of touched on the beginning of this, that the other side of the story is scientific literacy. You being someone who's teaching college-level students, how have you seen that? Are you encouraged or discouraged at the level that you see of students coming in to your classes?
Overall, the bigger problem would be apathy over misconceptions. I don't get too much nonsense questions from students. You get more apathy than anything else. Like I said, in terms of the astrology business, I think the students that I have now, most of them wouldn't be able to tell you much about horoscopes or anything, which is on one hand good, but it also may indicate a certain other ignorance as well.
I did one last comment, not really a question. I first heard about the star naming scam back in the late 90s. I read an article in Sky and Telescope magazine, and it was the star company that was suing astronomers at the time for calling them frauds. And then later, a while back, they put together another lawsuit and sued the star naming company and finally got them to admit that, well, it's a novelty item. And that's their fine print that they have to get away with. It's a novelty item. But you talk about how does it hurt people. Some of the astronomers said that some families would come in wanting to see the star named after their dead child, So that's pretty sad.
Predatory at some point,
Isn't it true, Dr. Austin, that the reason you haven't found Planet Nibiru is because you haven't looked for it?
That would be partly true. That I personally haven't looked for it.